Is it true that you're now the sole owner of Harrington Industries? The question hung in the air of the courthouse hallway, and Diane Campbell stood there, 7 years older than the broken woman who'd been thrown out of her own home. The reporter's microphone pushed closer to her face, cameras flashing, but she didn't flinch. Not anymore. Have you ever watched someone get everything they deserve? Not in a fairy tale, but in real life, where justice takes its sweet time but hits like a freight train when it finally arrives. That's what this story is about. Karma, patience, and the kind of strength that only comes from being pushed so far down that you have two choices. Stay there or claw your way back up. Before we go any further, I want to know, how are you doing today? Where are you watching from? Is it sunny where you are? Or is it one of those gray days that makes you want to stay inside and get lost in a story? Because that's exactly what I have for you. A story so wild, so emotionally raw, that once you start, you won't be able to stop. This is the story of Diane Campbell, a woman everyone underestimated, mocked, and tried to destroy. This is the story of how she went from a widow scrubbing floors in a rundown apartment to a billionaire who bought out the entire family that tried to erase her. And here's the thing that will keep you hooked. She did it all without raising a fist. Just patience, truth, and a dead man's love that reached beyond the grave. If you're ready for this journey, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a comment telling me where you're from. Trust me, you'll want to be part of this community when we unpack stories like this one. Now let me take you back to the beginning, to when Diane Campbell was just 24 years old and believed that love could conquer anything. Diane met Jonathan Harrington at a community art fair in the spring of 2008. She was a graduate student working part-time at a nonprofit. He was the heir to a manufacturing empire worth hundreds of millions. Nobody thought it would work. Nobody thought it should work. And his family made damn sure she knew it. But Jonathan didn't care what anyone thought. He was 32, had spent his whole life being told who to marry, where to work, how to live. Diane was different. She was genuine. She laughed at his terrible jokes, challenged his assumptions about the world, and never once asked him about his money. In fact, she didn't even know who he was for the first 3 weeks they dated. When he finally told her about Harrington Industries, about the estate, about the expectations, Diane almost walked away. She knew what this meant. She'd seen enough movies, heard enough stories. A Jamaican woman from a working-class family dating a wealthy white man from old money? The math didn't add up in America. It never had. Her mother had warned her over the phone from Kingston. Baby girl, dem people not go accept you. You know how dem stay. But Jonathan was persistent. He told her he loved her on their 4th month together. He proposed on their 1st anniversary. And when his mother, Constance Harrington, threatened to cut him off if he went through with the wedding, Jonathan did something that shocked everyone. He told his mother to go ahead. They got married in a small ceremony with Diane's family flying in from Jamaica and a handful of Jonathan's friends. His mother didn't attend. His sister, Victoria, sent a card that said simply, "You'll regret this." His brother, Gerald, didn't even acknowledge the wedding. Diane thought love would be enough. She thought that once they saw how happy Jonathan was, once they saw that she wasn't after his money, things would change. She kept believing that for 3 whole years. In those 3 years, she gave Jonathan 2 beautiful children. First came Caleb, with his father's blue eyes and his mother's warm spirit. Then came Maya, fierce and stubborn from the day she was born. Jonathan was devoted to them. He'd leave work early to make it to Caleb's preschool events. He'd spend Saturday mornings doing Maya's hair, watching YouTube tutorials to learn how to braid properly. Yes, Diane watched her husband transform from an obligation-driven executive into a man who finally understood what mattered. He started talking about changing his will, about making sure Diane and the kids were protected no matter what. He mentioned it over breakfast one Tuesday morning. "I need to update everything," Jonathan said, bouncing Maya on his knee while Caleb colored at the table. "The company paperwork, the estate documents, all of it. I want to make sure you're protected." Diane smiled at him from across the kitchen. "We're fine, John. We have everything we need." "No, I'm serious, Dee. My family." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "They're not going to just accept this. Accept you. I need to make sure that if anything happens to me, you and the kids are untouchable." "Nothing's going to happen to you," Diane said, "because that's what you say to your healthy 35-year-old husband. That's what you say when you're 27 and still believe the universe is fair." 6 weeks later, Jonathan Harrington collapsed at his office from a brain aneurysm. He was dead before the ambulance arrived. And that's when Diane's real nightmare began. The funeral was the first sign of what was coming. Constance Harrington made all the arrangements without consulting Diane. The service was held at a church Diane had never been to, filled with people she'd never met. When she arrived with Caleb and Maya, both children dressed in black, confused and crying, Constance looked at her like she was an intruder. "You'll sit in the second row," Constance told her, her voice cold and final. "Family sits in front." Diane felt the words hit her chest, but she didn't argue. Not at her husband's funeral. Not in front of her babies. She sat in the second row and listened to Victoria give a eulogy that didn't mention Diane or the children once. She stood at the burial and watched her husband lowered into the ground while his mother refused to make eye contact with her. And then came the will reading. 3 days after the funeral, Diane sat in a lawyer's office. Not her lawyer, but the Harrington family attorney, a man named Philip Strand who'd worked for Constance for 30 years. Gerald and Victoria sat on one side of the room. Constance sat in the center. Diane sat alone on the other side, holding a tissue, her eyes still swollen from crying. Strand cleared his throat and began reading. The will was dated 4 years prior, before Diane and Jonathan had even met. Everything, the estate, the company shares, the properties, went to the Harrington Family Trust, controlled by Constance. There was a small provision for any spouse that amounted to $50,000 and 1 year's residence in the estate. "Wait," Diane said, her voice breaking the silence. "This can't be right. Jonathan said he was updating everything. He told me he was protecting us." Strand looked at her with something that might have been pity, but felt more like condescension. "This is the last will and testament on file, Mrs. Harrington. Unless you have evidence of another document." Diane didn't, because Jonathan had died before he could finish what he started. Constance stood up, smoothing her black dress. "You'll have until the end of the month to remove yourself and your children from the estate. The $50,000 should be more than enough to get you started somewhere. Appropriate." That last word dripped with meaning. Somewhere appropriate. Somewhere for people like you. And Diane realized, sitting in that office, that she'd been naive. Love wasn't enough. It never had been. What happens when everything you believed in crumbles in a single moment? When the family that should protect you becomes the family that destroys you? Diane was about to find out just how far the Harringtons would go to erase her from their world. The month Diane had to leave the estate felt like 30 days of slow torture. Every morning she woke up in the bedroom she'd shared with Jonathan, surrounded by his things, his smell still faint on his pillow. Every morning she had to look at her children and pretend everything would be okay. Caleb was 4 years old. He kept asking when Daddy was coming home. Maya was only 2, too young to understand why her father wasn't there anymore, but old enough to sense that something was wrong. She cried more than usual, clung to Diane's legs, refused to let her mother out of sight. And through it all, the Harrington family moved through the estate like Diane, and her children were already gone. Gerald came by the second week with an appraiser. He didn't knock. He had a key. Of course he had a key. It was his family's house now. Diane was in the kitchen making lunch for the kids when she heard the front door open. "We're just doing an assessment," Gerald said when he saw her. He didn't apologize for barging in. "Need to know what updates the place needs before we list it." "You're selling the house?" Diane asked. Jonathan had loved this house. He'd bought it specifically because he wanted their children to grow up here, to have a backyard and good schools and stability. Gerald shrugged. "Mother wants to liquidate some assets. This place is worth about $4 million. Makes sense to sell. For $1 million. Diane felt sick. She was about to be homeless with 2 babies and $50,000 while they sold off her home for millions. Victoria came by the 3rd week. Unlike Gerald, she knocked, which Diane initially thought was respectful until she realized Victoria just didn't want to risk running into her. When Diane opened the door, Victoria stood there with 2 other women Diane didn't recognize. "We're here to go through Jonathan's personal effects," Victoria said. "Family heirlooms, photographs, that sort of thing. His children are his family," Diane said quietly. Victoria smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Of course, but there are certain items that belong to the Harrington legacy. I'm sure you understand." Diane let them in because she didn't know what else to do. She watched them box up Jonathan's childhood photo albums, his father's watch, his grandfather's cufflinks. Things Jonathan had planned to pass down to Caleb one day. "Those are for his son," Diane tried to say when Victoria picked up the watch. "These are Harrington heirlooms," Victoria corrected. "They stay with the Harrington family." The implication was clear. Diane and her children weren't really Harringtons. Not to them. But the worst visit came from Constance herself, 1 week before Diane was scheduled to leave. The older woman arrived in a black car with her driver, dressed like she was attending another funeral. She didn't come inside. She stood at the front door and waited for Diane to come to her. "I wanted to discuss the children," Constance said. Diane's heart stopped. "What about them?" "They're Harringtons. Jonathan's bloodline. They deserve to be raised with certain standards." Constance looked past Diane into the house. "I'm prepared to offer you an additional $200,000 if you agree to let me have primary custody. You can visit, of course. Supervised visits on weekends." Diane couldn't breathe. "You want to take my children?" "I want to give them the life they deserve. The life their father would have wanted for them." Constance finally looked at Diane directly. "Let's be honest, Ms. Campbell. What can you provide for them? You have no job, no family here, no support system. That $50,000 will run out in a few months. What then? You'll be living in some tiny apartment, working multiple jobs just to keep the lights on. Is that what you want for Jonathan's children?" Every word was designed to cut, and it worked. Because Constance wasn't entirely wrong. Diane had no idea how she was going to survive. She'd left her graduate program when she got pregnant with Caleb. She'd been a full-time mother for 4 years. Her resume had a massive gap. Her family back in Jamaica couldn't help financially. They were barely getting by themselves. But giving up her children? Never. "No," Diane said. "My children stay with me." Constance's expression hardened. "You're being selfish. You're putting your pride ahead of their welfare. I'm their mother." "You were Jonathan's mistake," Constance said, and there it was. The truth she'd been holding back finally out in the open. A pretty distraction he convinced himself was love. But look at you. Look at what you came from. Did you really think this would last? Did you really think you belonged in this world? Diane wanted to scream. She wanted to cry. She wanted to tell this woman that Jonathan had loved her, that their marriage was real, that she belonged anywhere her children were. But she just stood there, silent, as Constance got back in her car and drove away. That night, Diane packed their lives into whatever boxes she could find. 3 years of marriage, 4 years of motherhood, reduced to a few suitcases and boxes. She called her cousin Grace, who lived 2 hours away in a rougher part of the city. "I just need a few weeks," Diane said on the phone, trying not to cry. "Just until I find a place." Grace didn't hesitate. "Come stay with me. You and the babies. We'll figure it out." But Diane knew Grace lived in a 1-bedroom apartment and worked 2 jobs. This wasn't a solution. It was just a delay of the inevitable. The morning Diane left the estate, none of the Harringtons came to say goodbye. She loaded her boxes into her car, a modest sedan Jonathan had bought her, one of the few things she still owned outright. She buckled Caleb and Maya into their car seats. She took one last look at the house where she'd been happy, where she'd felt safe, where she'd believed her future was secure. And then she drove away. Grace's apartment was exactly as small as Diane remembered. The kids slept on an air mattress in the living room. Diane slept on the couch. Grace worked nights at a hospital and days at a retail store, so she was rarely home, which was both a blessing and a curse. It meant less crowding, but it also meant Diane was alone with her grief and her fear. She started looking for work immediately, but every application felt impossible. What skills did she have? She'd been 2 semesters away from a master's in social work when she dropped out. She had retail experience from college, some administrative work from internships. Nothing that would pay enough to support 2 children. The $50,000 from Jonathan's will sat in her bank account like a ticking time bomb. Rent for even a modest 2-bedroom apartment in a safe area would cost at least $1,500 a month. Childcare for 2 kids would be another $2,000. Food, utilities, transportation, health insurance. The math didn't work. The money would be gone within a year, maybe less. And then what? 2 months after leaving the estate, Diane finally found a job. Housekeeping at a hotel chain. It paid $13 an hour. It wasn't enough. She took a second job waitressing on weekends. Grace watched the kids when she could, but mostly Diane had to pay a neighbor's teenage daughter to babysit, which ate into her already thin paychecks. She moved out of Grace's place after 3 months, into a 2-bedroom apartment in a building that had seen better days. The neighborhood was rough. Gunshots at night weren't uncommon. The schools were underfunded and overcrowded. This was the life Constance had predicted. This was the reality Diane was living. And it was about to get worse. 6 months after Jonathan's death, Diane saw the announcement on the news. Gerald Harrington had been named CEO of Harrington Industries. The company stock had jumped 12% on the news. Gerald stood at a podium, looking confident and accomplished, talking about leading the company into a new era. The company Jonathan had built up. The company he'd spent 15-hour days growing. The company he'd planned to leave to his children. Now it belonged to his brother. Diane turned off the television before the kids could see. But the damage was done. She couldn't stop thinking about it. About how much Jonathan had sacrificed for that company. About how he'd talked about Caleb maybe running it one day. About setting up trusts for the kids' education and future. All of it gone. A week later, she got served with papers. Victoria was suing for grandparents' rights, demanding visitation with Caleb and Maya. The legal document claimed that Diane was providing an unstable environment for the children and that the Harrington family had a right to maintain a relationship with their late brother's offspring. Diane couldn't afford a lawyer. She represented herself at the hearing, exhausted from working double shifts, wearing the nicest clothes she still owned. A black dress she'd worn to Jonathan's funeral. The judge granted Victoria supervised visitation. Once a month. For hours. And that's when the real humiliation started. Victoria picked up the children at Diane's apartment the first Saturday of every month. She always arrived in a different luxury car, always dressed impeccably, always with a look of barely disguised disgust when she saw where Diane lived. "Mommy, Aunt Victoria took us to a fancy restaurant," Caleb said after the first visit. "She said Daddy used to eat there all the time. She bought me a new dress," Maya added, showing off an outfit that cost more than Diane made in a week. The message was clear. Look at what we can give them. Look at what you can't. The visits continued. Every month, Victoria showed the children the life they could have had. The life that was taken from them. And every month, Diane felt smaller, more powerless, more aware of how completely she'd lost. 1 year after Jonathan's death, Diane stood in her tiny apartment bathroom, looking at herself in the cracked mirror. She'd aged 5 years and 12 months. Her hands were rough from cleaning chemicals. Her feet ached constantly from standing all day. She had $14 in her checking account until her next paycheck. And she had no idea how much longer she could keep this up. Diane's breaking point came on a Tuesday morning, 18 months after Jonathan's death. She was at work, cleaning a hotel room on the 6th floor, when her phone rang. The daycare. Her stomach dropped before she even answered. "Ms. Campbell, we need you to come pick up Maya. She's running a fever of 102. Diane closed her eyes. She was only 3 hours into an 8-hour shift. If she left now, they'd send her home for the day. That was 8 hours of pay she couldn't afford to lose. But Maya was sick. "I'll be right there," she said. Her supervisor wasn't happy. "This is the 3rd time this month you've left early. My daughter is sick. I understand, but we need reliable employees. If this continues, we'll have to reevaluate your position here." Diane bit back everything she wanted to say and went to get her daughter. Maya's fever got worse. By that night, it was 104. Diane took her to the emergency room, where they waited for 3 hours before seeing a doctor. Strep throat. They prescribed antibiotics that cost $60 even with Diane's bare-bones insurance. She put it on her credit card, the one she'd sworn she wouldn't use except for emergencies. It was already maxed out from the last emergency, Caleb breaking his arm at school 2 months ago. The bill from the ER came 2 weeks later. $1,800 after insurance. Diane stared at the number until the words blurred. She had no idea how she was going to pay it. That same week, her car broke down. The mechanic said it needed $900 in repairs. Diane wanted to cry. The car was the last thing Jonathan had bought her. It was her only way to get to work, to take the kids to daycare, to function. "Can I pay in installments?" she asked. The mechanic looked sympathetic, but shook his head. "Sorry, we need payment up front." Diane took the bus home. With 2 kids. In the rain. Maya was still recovering from strep. Caleb kept asking why they couldn't just drive. By the time they got back to the apartment, all 3 of them were soaked and miserable. That night, after putting the kids to bed, Diane sat at her kitchen table and spread out all her bills. rent, utilities, daycare, credit cards, medical bills, car repairs. The math was impossible. She was $2,000 short, and she had no idea where to get it. She thought about calling her mother in Jamaica, but she already knew what the answer would be. Her family didn't have money to spare. They were barely getting by themselves. She thought about taking out a loan, but her credit was already destroyed from maxed-out cards and late payments. She thought about asking Grace, but Grace had already helped so much and had her own financial struggles. There was only one option left, and Diane hated herself for even considering it. The next morning, she called the Harrington estate and asked to speak with Constance. The housekeeper who answered sounded surprised to hear from her. "Please hold." 5 minutes passed. Then Constance's voice came on the line, cold and formal. "Yes, I need help," Diane said, the words sticking in her throat. "I need to borrow some money. Just a loan. I'll pay it back." Silence on the other end. Then, "How much?" $2,000. "I have medical bills and car repairs and—" "No." Diane felt like she'd been slapped. "Please. It's for your grandchildren. Maya was sick and the bills." "You made your choice when you refused my offer," Constance said. "You wanted to keep the children and raise them yourself. That means providing for them yourself. I am providing for them. I just need help this one time." "The answer is no. And Ms. Campbell, don't call here again." The line went dead. Diane sat there holding the phone, numb. She'd begged. She'd humiliated herself. And for what? To be reminded that to the Harringtons she was nothing. But it got worse. 2 days later, Victoria showed up for her monthly visitation with the children. She took them to the Harrington estate, the same house Diane had been forced to leave. When she brought them back 4 hours later, Caleb was unusually quiet. "What's wrong, baby?" Diane asked after Victoria left. Caleb, now 5 years old, looked up at his mother with confused eyes. "Grandma Constance said we could live with them, in a big house with our own rooms. She said we could go to a good school and have nice toys." Diane's blood went cold. "What else did she say?" "She said you're doing your best, but sometimes mommies can't give their kids everything they need. She said she wants to help." Maya, now 3, piped up. "She said we're Harringtons. That's special." Diane wanted to scream. They were poisoning her children against her, making them think she wasn't enough, making them want the life she couldn't provide. "You are Harringtons," Diane said carefully, "but you're also Campbells. And your mommy loves you more than anything in this world." But she could see it in Caleb's eyes. The doubt. The seed had been planted. That night, Diane got a letter. Not from the Harringtons, from the apartment management. A notice of eviction. She was 2 months behind on rent. She had 30 days to pay the full amount owed plus late fees, or she'd be forced to leave. The total was $4,000. Diane couldn't breathe. She couldn't pay it. She had nothing left. No savings. No credit. No family who could help. No options. She was going to be homeless with 2 children. The next week was a blur of panic and desperation. Diane picked up extra shifts at the hotel. She worked double shifts waitressing. She slept 4 hours a night and ran on coffee and fear. But it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. And then Victoria filed for emergency custody. The papers came with a court date just 2 weeks away. The petition claimed that Diane was unable to provide adequate housing, that she was working excessive hours and leaving the children in substandard care, that she was facing eviction and couldn't maintain stability. How did they know about the eviction? Had they been watching her? Checking on her? Waiting for her to fail? The petition requested that Caleb and Maya be placed in the temporary custody of their grandmother, Constance Harrington, pending a full custody hearing. Diane read the papers 3 times, each time hoping she'd misunderstood. But the words were clear. They were trying to take her children, and they had evidence that she was struggling, evidence that was impossible to deny. She called every legal aid office in the city. Most had waiting lists months long. The one attorney who agreed to see her looked at the case and shook his head. "Mrs. Harrington, I'm going to be honest with you. This doesn't look good. You're facing eviction. You're working multiple jobs, which means you're not home with the kids. Your finances are a mess, and they have unlimited resources to fight this. So what do I do?" Diane asked. "You need to stabilize your situation. Fast. Get current on rent. Cut back on work hours to spend more time with the children. Show the court you can provide a stable environment." "How am I supposed to cut back on work when I can't even pay my bills now?" The attorney had no answer for that. Diane left the office feeling like she was drowning. Every direction she turned, there was another wall. Every choice led to disaster. Work more hours and lose her kids for neglect. Work fewer hours and lose her kids because she couldn't house them. She was trapped. The preliminary custody hearing was held on a Friday morning. Diane had to call out sick from both jobs to attend. She couldn't afford to miss the money, but she couldn't miss the hearing. The Harringtons showed up with 2 attorneys. Diane represented herself again. The judge listened to both sides. Victoria's lawyers presented bank statements showing Diane's overdrafts. They presented the eviction notice. They presented statements from the daycare about how often Diane was late picking up the children. They painted a picture of a struggling single mother who couldn't keep her head above water. And it was all true. Diane tried to defend herself. She explained that she was working hard to provide for her children, that she loved them, that she was doing her best. But the judge's face was sympathetic in the way that meant he'd already made up his mind. "I'm granting temporary custody to Mrs. Constance Harrington," he said. "The children will reside with their grandmother for the next 60 days while we assess the situation. Ms. Campbell will have supervised visitation twice a week for 2 hours each visit." Diane felt the courtroom spin. "No, please. You can't take my babies. This is temporary," the judge said, but his tone was final. "Use this time to stabilize your living situation. If you can demonstrate adequate housing and financial stability, we'll revisit custody at the next hearing." They took Caleb and Maya that same day. Diane was allowed 15 minutes to say goodbye. She knelt down in front of her children in the courthouse hallway, trying not to cry, trying not to scare them. "You're going to stay with Grandma Constance for a little while," she said, her voice shaking. "But Mommy will see you soon. And I love you so, so much." Caleb's face crumpled. "I want to stay with you." "I know, baby. I know. But it's just for a little bit." Maya was crying, clinging to Diane's neck. "Don't leave me, Mommy." "I'm not leaving you," Diane sobbed. "I would never leave you. I'll see you in a few days, I promise." Security had to pull Maya off her. Diane watched Victoria lead her children away, watched them disappear around the corner, and something inside her shattered completely. That night, alone in her apartment, the apartment she was about to lose, Diane sat on the floor and cried until she had nothing left. The Harringtons had taken everything. Her home, her security, her husband's company, his family heirlooms, and now her children. She had nothing left to lose. But what Diane didn't realize was that sometimes you have to lose everything before you can find out who you really are. Sometimes you have to hit absolute rock bottom before you can start climbing back up. And sometimes the people who think they've won have no idea what's actually coming for them. Because while Diane was breaking apart, something else was happening. Something that had been set in motion almost 2 years ago. Something that would change everything. Diane had been stripped of everything she loved. The Harringtons had won, or so they thought. But rock bottom has a way of teaching you exactly how strong you are. And Diane was about to learn that she was stronger than anyone ever imagined. Have you ever felt so broken that you didn't think you could survive another day? Have you ever had everything taken from you by people who smiled while they did it? Drop a comment and let me know, because what I'm about to tell you about Diane's next few months will either break your heart or make you believe in the kind of strength most people don't know they have. The first week without her children nearly killed Diane. She'd wake up in the morning and instinctively listen for Maya's voice or Caleb's footsteps. Then she'd remember they weren't there, and the grief would hit her all over again. The apartment felt like a tomb. Their toys were still scattered in the living room. Their beds were still unmade from the last time they'd slept there. Diane couldn't bring herself to clean any of it up. She went to her first supervised visitation on Wednesday. The Harringtons had arranged for the visits to take place at a child services facility. A sterile room with cameras and a supervisor watching everything. Like Diane was a threat to her own children. Caleb and Maya ran to her when they walked in, and for 2 hours, Diane held them and played with them and pretended everything was normal. But when the time was up and they had to leave, Maya screamed. She wrapped her arms around Diane's legs and refused to let go. "I want to go home with Mommy," she cried. The supervisor had to pry her away. Diane watched her daughter being carried out, reaching for her, crying for her, and Diane couldn't do anything except stand there and watch. The supervisor looked at her with pity. It gets easier. But it didn't. The second visit was worse. Caleb had grown quiet, distant. When Diane asked him about staying at the Harrington estate, he just shrugged. "It's okay," he said. "I have my own room. And lots of toys. Do you miss home?" Diane asked carefully. Caleb looked down. "Grandma Constance says this is our home now." Diane felt something crack inside her chest. They were erasing her. Slowly, methodically, they were making her children forget that they belonged with her. Now, I need to ask you something. If you're watching this and you're feeling what Diane felt, hit that like button. And if you think you would have given up at this point, be honest in the comments. Because what happens next is where most people would have broken completely. But subscribe to this channel, because I'm about to show you what happens when a mother decides that giving up is not an option. Between the 2 weekly visits with her children, Diane worked. She picked up every shift she could. She waitressed until her feet bled. She cleaned hotel rooms until her hands were raw. She was saving every penny for a lawyer, for a better apartment, for anything that might help her get her children back. But the Harringtons weren't idle. 3 weeks after taking custody of the children, Constance enrolled them in an elite private school. The tuition was $40,000 a year, per child. She made sure to mention this in court documents filed for the upcoming custody hearing. "The children are thriving in their new environment," the filing stated. "They have access to educational opportunities, extracurricular activities, and a stable home life that Ms. Campbell cannot provide." Gerald expanded Harrington Industries, acquiring 2 smaller manufacturing companies. The business magazines ran profiles on him, calling him a visionary leader who was taking the company to new heights. In every interview, he mentioned his late brother Jonathan. "I'm doing this to honor his legacy," Gerald told one reporter, "to build something that will last for generations of Harringtons to come." But he never mentioned Jonathan's children, never acknowledged that Caleb and Maya existed. Victoria started a charity foundation in Jonathan's name. She held a gala fundraiser at the Harrington estate, the same estate Diane had been thrown out of. The event raised $2 million for pediatric medical research. Victoria gave a speech about her beloved brother and his commitment to helping children. The irony wasn't lost on Diane when she saw the coverage online. Victoria claimed to care about children while actively working to keep 2 of them from their mother. The Harringtons were building a narrative. They were the grieving family honoring Jonathan's memory. They were the responsible grandparents providing for his children. They were successful, stable, generous pillars of the community. And Diane, she was the struggling single mother who couldn't keep a roof over her head. The woman who worked too much and wasn't around enough. The outsider who'd never really belonged in their world anyway. For months after losing custody, Diane got evicted from her apartment. She'd managed to delay it, but she couldn't pay what she owed. Her belongings were put out on the sidewalk on a Tuesday afternoon while she was at work. Grace helped her move everything into a storage unit. It cost $80 a month that Diane didn't have, but she couldn't lose the kids' things. Their clothes, their toys, their beds. When she got them back, not if, when she needed to have their things ready. She moved into Grace's apartment again. Back on the couch. Back to having nothing. The custody hearing was scheduled for 6 months after the temporary order. Diane had exactly 2 months to turn her life around. 2 months to find a stable home, to prove she could provide for her children, to demonstrate to a judge that she deserved to be their mother. But how? She was working 3 jobs now: housekeeping at the hotel, waitressing on weekends, and overnight shifts stocking shelves at a grocery store. She barely slept. She barely ate. Every penny went into savings for a security deposit on an apartment. But apartments in safe neighborhoods with good schools required first month's rent, last month's rent, security deposit, and application fees. She needed at least $5,000 just to move in somewhere. And she had $800 saved. The math didn't work. It never worked. Then something happened that Diane didn't expect. Something small, but it mattered. She was waitressing on a Saturday night, exhausted and running on fumes, when a woman came in alone and sat in Diane's section. The woman was well-dressed, professional, maybe in her 50s. She ordered dinner and worked on her laptop while she ate. When Diane brought the check, the woman looked up at her. "Are you okay?" The question was so unexpected that Diane's careful composure cracked. "I'm fine. Just tired. You look like you're carrying the weight of the world," the woman said gently. Diane forced a smile. Something like that. The woman paid her bill and left a $50 tip on a $30 meal. But she also left her business card. Naomi Fletcher, attorney at law. family law specialist. On the back she'd written, "Call me if you need help." Diane stared at the card for a long time. Then she tucked it into her pocket and went back to work. She'd learned not to trust kindness from strangers, especially not in a world where the people who should have loved her had destroyed her instead. But 3 days later, when she got the notice that the custody hearing had been moved up by 2 weeks, Diane pulled out the card and made the call. Naomi Fletcher's office was small but professional. When Diane arrived for their meeting, Naomi offered her coffee and actually waited for her to sit down before starting. "Tell me your situation," Naomi said. Diane did. She told her everything. About Jonathan, about his death, about the will that left her with almost nothing, about Constance's cruelty, about Gerald taking over the company, about Victoria's visitations that were designed to show the children what Diane couldn't provide, about losing her home, her stability, her children. Naomi listened without interrupting. When Diane finished, she sat back in her chair. "I'm going to be honest with you," Naomi said. "This is going to be difficult. The Harringtons have resources, they have legal representation, and they've built a strong case that they can provide better for your children than you can." Diane nodded. She'd expected this. "But," Naomi continued, "judges don't just care about money. They care about what's best for the children. And what's best for children is usually being with a parent who loves them. We need to show that you're stable, that you're working to improve your situation, and that you've been a good mother despite impossible circumstances." "How do I do that when I'm living on my cousin's couch?" Diane asked. "We document everything. Every visit with your children. Every job you work. Every penny you save. We show that you're doing everything humanly possible to provide for them." Naomi paused. "And I'm going to take your case pro bono." Diane felt tears spring to her eyes. "Why?" "Because I've seen families like the Harringtons before," Naomi said, and something hard flashed in her eyes. "Wealthy people who think they can buy children like they buy everything else. And I don't like it." For the first time in months, Diane felt something other than despair. It wasn't hope exactly. It was smaller than that. It was just the possibility that maybe she wasn't completely alone in this fight. But the Harringtons weren't done twisting the knife. 1 week before the custody hearing, Victoria brought the children to visitation. They were dressed in expensive new clothes. Caleb had a new haircut. Maya was wearing tiny diamond earrings. "Mommy, look," Maya said, showing off her ears. "Grandma took me to get my ears pierced." Diane felt rage bubble up. Maya was 3 years old. Diane had planned to let her get her ears pierced when she was older, when she could make that choice herself. But Constance had taken even that from her. Another first she'd stolen. "They're beautiful, baby," Diane managed to say. After the visit, Diane confronted Victoria in the parking lot. "You had no right to pierce her ears without asking me." Victoria looked at her coolly. "I'm her legal guardian right now. I don't need to ask your permission. I'm still her mother." "Are you?" Victoria tilted her head. "Because from where I'm standing, you're just a woman who gets to see them 4 hours a week. That's not a mother. That's a visitor." The words hit exactly where Victoria meant them to. Diane wanted to scream, to hit her, to do something. But she just stood there, powerless, as Victoria drove away with her children. That night, Diane called her mother in Jamaica. She hadn't wanted to burden her family with what was happening, but she needed to hear her mother's voice. "Diane, baby, what's wrong?" her mother asked immediately. Diane broke down and told her everything. Her mother listened, and when Diane finished, there was a long silence. "Dem people wicked," her mother finally said. "But listen to me, Diane. You is a Campbell. We come from strong people. Your grandmother raised 9 children on nothing but faith and hard work. Your great-grandmother survived things that would break most people. That strength is in your blood. I don't feel strong, Mama. I feel like I'm losing. You not losing. You fighting. And fighting means you haven't given up." Her mother's voice was firm. "You keep fighting for those babies. You hear me? You keep fighting." Diane wiped her eyes. "Yes, Mama." After she hung up, Diane looked at herself in Grace's bathroom mirror. She looked exhausted, defeated. But underneath that there was something else. Something that hadn't been there before. Anger. Not the hot, explosive kind. The cold, determined kind. The kind that burns slow and steady and doesn't go out. The Harringtons thought they'd broken her. They thought she'd just accept what they'd done, crawl away, and disappear. They were wrong. The custody hearing was in 1 week. Diane didn't have a perfect home to show the judge. She didn't have money or stability or any of the things the Harringtons could offer. But she had something they didn't have. She had love. Real love. The kind that doesn't come with conditions. The kind that doesn't measure a child's worth by how they reflect on the family name. And she had the truth. She also had Naomi Fletcher, who was preparing a case that focused on Diane's dedication, her consistency, her unwavering commitment to her children despite impossible odds. "We're going to show that court who you are," Naomi told her. "Not who the Harringtons say you are. Who you really are." But what neither Diane nor Naomi knew was that across town, in a small law office that had nothing to do with the Harringtons, someone else was watching this case unfold. Someone who'd been watching for almost 2 years. Someone who had information that could change everything. But the time wasn't right yet. Not quite yet. The Harringtons needed to show exactly who they were first. They needed to prove beyond any doubt that they were willing to destroy Diane completely. And they were about to do exactly that. Now let me ask you, have you ever been in a situation where you had to fight for something everyone said you'd never win? Comment below and let me know. Because what's about to happen to Diane at this custody hearing will either restore your faith in justice or make you question everything you believe about the legal system. The custody hearing was coming. Diane had a lawyer now, and a fire burning inside her that refused to go out. But the Harringtons had unlimited resources and a plan to destroy her credibility once and for all. The question wasn't whether Diane would fight. It was whether fighting would be enough. The custody hearing started at 9 in the morning on a Thursday. Diane arrived 30 minutes early with Naomi Fletcher, wearing the only professional outfit she still owned. The same black dress from Jonathan's funeral, paired with a cardigan Grace had lent her. The Harringtons arrived 10 minutes later with their team of attorneys. 3 of them. Constance wore a tailored navy suit. Victoria and Gerald flanked her like sentries. They looked like what they were: money, power, and absolute confidence. Diane's hands were shaking. Naomi reached over and squeezed her arm. "Remember," Naomi whispered, "you're their mother. Nothing they say changes that." But Diane was about to learn that in a courtroom, truth and justice don't always align. The judge was a woman in her early 60s named Judge Patricia Thornton. She'd been on the bench for 20 years, had a reputation for being fair but tough. Diane searched her face for some sign of sympathy and found none. Just professional neutrality. The Harringtons' lead attorney was a man named Richard Ashford. He stood up first, and his opening statement was a masterclass in character assassination disguised as concern. "Your Honor, this case is about what's best for 2 young children who've already lost their father. Caleb and Maya Harrington deserve stability, security, and the kind of life their father would have wanted for them. My clients are not seeking to punish Ms. Campbell. They're seeking to provide for their grandchildren in ways she simply cannot." He laid out the facts methodically. Diane's eviction, her multiple jobs, her lack of permanent housing, the supervised visitation reports that noted how upset the children became when they had to leave her, which he spun as evidence that the visits were traumatic for them. Then he brought out the financial records. "Ms. Campbell has $17,000 in debt," Ashford said, presenting documents. 3 maxed-out credit cards. Medical bills in collections. She's currently living on her cousin's couch. She works approximately 70 hours per week at 3 different jobs, which means she's barely home even when she has housing. Every word was true. Every word was damning. "In contrast," Ashford continued, "my clients have provided the children with their own rooms in a 6-bedroom estate. They've enrolled them in one of the best private schools in the state. They've ensured the children have regular medical care, extracurricular activities, and a stable routine." He showed photographs. Caleb and Maya in their school uniforms, smiling. The children's bedrooms at the estate, beautifully decorated. A photo of them at a birthday party with other well-dressed children. Diane had never seen most of these photos. She hadn't been invited to Maya's 4th birthday party. She hadn't known they were thriving without her. The word thriving kept coming up. The children were thriving. They had adjusted well. They were happy. Without her. When it was Naomi's turn, she stood up and presented Diane's side. She talked about the bond between mother and children. She presented character witnesses, Grace, who testified about how hard Diane worked. The supervisor from the hotel, who said Diane was reliable and dedicated. One of Diane's former professors, who spoke about her intelligence and determination. But none of it seemed to matter when stacked against the Harringtons' resources. Then Naomi called Diane to the stand. "Mrs. Harrington, tell the court about your relationship with your children." Diane took a breath. "They're my whole world. Everything I do, every hour I work, every sacrifice I make, it's all for them. I know I don't have a big house or a lot of money, but I love them. I know them. I know that Caleb is scared of the dark and needs his nightlight on. I know that Maya won't eat her vegetables unless you make them into funny shapes. I know their favorite stories and their bad dreams and the songs that make them feel safe. And if you regain custody, how will you provide for them? I'll keep working. I've been saving for an apartment. I'm close to having enough for a deposit. And once I have stable housing, I can cut back on some of my hours. I can be there for them." It sounded weak even to her own ears. "I'm close to having enough" wasn't the same as "I have a home ready." "I can cut back" wasn't the same as "I have time for them now." When Ashford cross-examined her, he went for the throat. "Ms. Campbell, you currently have $843 in your savings account. Is that correct?" Diane hesitated. "Yes. And you need approximately $5,000 for a security deposit and first month's rent on an apartment in a safe neighborhood with good schools." "Correct. Yes. So you're $4,000 short. I'm working on it." "How long have you been working on it?" 6 months. 6 months, and you've saved less than $1,000. He let that hang in the air. "At this rate, it will take you over 2 more years to save enough to move out of your cousin's apartment. Is that your plan? To have your children live on a couch for 2 years? No, Where exactly would they sleep if they came home with you today?" Diane's throat tightened. "On the air mattress. Like before. The air mattress in your cousin's living room, where you also sleep. It's temporary. It's been 6 months. That's not temporary. That's your life." Naomi objected, but the damage was done. Then Ashford pulled out something Diane hadn't expected. "I'd like to call Dr. Patricia Moreno to the stand." A woman in her 40s stood up from the back of the courtroom. Diane didn't recognize her. Dr. Moreno was a child psychologist. She testified that she'd been working with Caleb and Maya for the past 2 months at Constance Harrington's request. "And what have you observed about the children's adjustment?" Ashford asked. "Initially, they showed signs of anxiety and attachment disorder," Dr. Moreno said. "They had difficulty sleeping, frequent tantrums, regression in behavior. Classic signs of trauma and instability." Diane felt sick. Her babies had been suffering, and she hadn't known. "And now," Ashford prompted, "they've improved significantly. Their sleep patterns have normalized. Their behavior has stabilized. They're excelling academically and socially. They've formed secure attachments with their grandmother and aunt. In your professional opinion, what would happen if we disrupted this stability by moving them back to their mother's care?" Dr. Moreno looked uncomfortable, but she answered, "It would likely cause significant regression. The children have finally found stability. Removing them from that environment could be psychologically harmful." Naomi cross-examined, asking if the children had been asked about their mother, about whether they wanted to see her more. Dr. Moreno admitted they had. She admitted that both children expressed love for their mother and wanted to see her. But when asked if moving back with Diane would be in their best interest given the current circumstances, Dr. Moreno said no. The hearing lasted 4 hours. By the end, Diane felt like she'd been put through a shredder. Judge Thornton took a 30-minute recess to review everything. When she came back, her expression was unreadable. "I've reviewed all the evidence and testimony," she began. "This is a difficult case. There's no question that Ms. Campbell loves her children. There's also no question that she's working hard to provide for them." Diane felt a small flutter of hope. "However," Judge Thornton continued, and that one word killed the hope instantly, "my primary concern must be the best interests of the children. And based on the evidence presented, I find that the children's best interests are served by remaining in the custody of their grandmother, Constance Harrington." The courtroom tilted. Diane heard Naomi say something, but it sounded far away. "Furthermore," the judge said, "I'm concerned about the emotional impact of the current visitation schedule on the children. The supervised visitation reports indicate significant distress during transitions. Therefore, I'm modifying the visitation order. No. Ms. Campbell will be granted 1 supervised visit per month for 2 hours, until such time as she can demonstrate stable housing and employment that allows her to maintain a consistent presence in the children's lives. 1 visit per month." Diane couldn't breathe. If Ms. Campbell can show proof of stable housing and reduced work hours that allow for proper childcare, she may petition the court to modify this order. But until then, custody remains with Mrs. Constance Harrington. The gavel came down. Diane sat frozen. 1 visit per month. 2 hours. With her own children. Naomi was talking to her, saying something about appealing, about working harder, about not giving up. But Diane couldn't hear her over the ringing in her ears. The Harringtons stood up. Constance looked satisfied. Victoria actually smiled. Gerald was already on his phone, probably going back to running the company that should have belonged to Diane's children. They filed out of the courtroom like they'd just won a business negotiation. Because to them, that's all this was. A transaction. A acquisition. They'd acquired 2 children the same way Gerald acquired companies. Diane walked out into the hallway and saw them standing there, talking to their attorneys. Constance looked up and saw her. For just a moment, their eyes met, and Constance smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who'd won. Someone who'd crushed their opponent completely. Diane turned and walked toward the bathroom. She made it into a stall before she started sobbing. Great, heaving sobs that tore out of her chest. She'd lost. She'd fought as hard as she could, and she'd lost. 1 visit per month. Her children would forget her. They'd grow up thinking Constance was their real family. They'd forget the songs Diane sang to them, the way she did their hair, the sound of her voice. She cried until there was nothing left. When she finally came out, Naomi was waiting in the hallway. "I'm so sorry," Naomi said, and she looked genuinely devastated. "We can appeal. We can." "How long does an appeal take?" Diane asked, her voice hollow. 6 months. Maybe longer. 6 months of seeing her children 2 hours a month. 6 months of them slipping further away from her. "And what are the chances we win?" Naomi hesitated. "Honestly? Not good. Not unless your circumstances change dramatically." Diane nodded. "Thank you for trying. Diane, don't give up. We can." "I have to go." Diane walked out of the courthouse into the afternoon sun. She got on the bus because she still didn't have a car. She rode it to Grace's apartment. She walked inside, went to the bathroom, and looked at herself in the mirror. She looked like a stranger, like someone who'd been hollowed out and discarded. The Harringtons had taken everything. Her home, her husband's legacy, his company, his family heirlooms, and now, functionally, her children. There was nothing left to take. That night, Grace tried to comfort her, but there was nothing to say. Diane lay on the couch and stared at the ceiling. Her phone buzzed with a call from her mother in Jamaica, but she couldn't talk to her, couldn't bear to say the words out loud. "I lost them." 3 days later, she got a letter from Victoria's attorney. It outlined the new visitation schedule and included a suggestion that Diane consider signing over full custody voluntarily. It would be less traumatic for the children than prolonged legal battles. They wanted her to give up, to just disappear. And for the first time since Jonathan died, Diane actually considered it. Maybe they were right. Maybe the children were better off with their grandmother's money and stability. Maybe Diane's love wasn't enough. Maybe she was being selfish, holding on when she should let go. She sat at Grace's kitchen table with the custody papers in front of her. All she had to do was sign. Release her children to the Harringtons permanently. Stop fighting a battle she couldn't win. Her pen hovered over the signature line. But then she thought about Caleb's face when he'd hugged her at the last visit. About Maya saying, "I love you, Mommy," before being taken away. About Jonathan's voice in her memory. "I want to make sure you and the kids are untouchable." He'd tried to protect them. He'd failed because he died too soon. But he'd tried. And Diane realized something sitting there in that tiny kitchen. The Harringtons could take her home. They could take her money. They could even take her children, for now. But they couldn't take who she was. They couldn't take the fact that she was Caleb and Maya's mother. They couldn't take the strength that her own mother had talked about. The Campbell strength that came from generations of women who'd survived things that should have broken them. Diane put down the pen without signing. She wasn't giving up. But she also had no idea how to win. She was drowning in debt, working 3 jobs just to survive, living on her cousin's couch, and allowed to see her children 2 hours a month. The Harringtons had unlimited resources, unlimited time, and the full backing of the legal system. How do you fight that? How do you win when everything is stacked against you? Diane didn't have an answer. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that 300 miles away, in a filing cabinet in a law office she'd never heard of, There was a document that would answer every one of those questions. A document that Jonathan had created to protect her. A document that no one knew existed. Yet, I want to pause here and ask you something. Have you ever been in a moment where everything seemed lost? Where you couldn't see any way forward? Drop a comment and tell me, because what I'm about to tell you next will show you why sometimes the darkest moment comes right before everything changes. Hit that subscribe button, because you're going to want to see how this story unfolds. The first month under the new visitation order was the longest month of Diane's life. She marked the days on a calendar Grace had given her. 28 days until she could see her children again. 27. 26. Each day felt like a year. She threw herself into work because it was the only thing that kept her from thinking. The hotel manager had cut her hours after she'd missed so many shifts for court dates, so she picked up more hours at the grocery store. She was stocking shelves at 3 in the morning, sleeping 4 hours, then waitressing from noon to 8 at night. Grace barely saw her anymore. They'd pass each other like ships. Grace coming home as Diane was leaving. Diane returning after Grace had gone to bed. "You're going to burn out," Grace told her one morning when they happened to overlap. "I can't afford to burn out," Diane replied, pulling on her shoes. "I need to save money. I need to get a place. I need to show the court I'm stable. You need to sleep." But Diane couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Caleb and Maya, heard their voices, felt Maya's little arms around her neck. Sleep meant dreams, and dreams meant waking up to remember all over again that her children were gone. 3 weeks into the month, Diane's body made the decision for her. She collapsed at work. 1 minute she was carrying a tray of drinks to a table. The next she was on the floor, the sound of breaking glass in her ears. The restaurant manager called an ambulance over her protests. "I'm fine," Diane kept saying as the paramedics checked her vitals. "I just got dizzy. I need to finish my shift." But her blood pressure was dangerously low. She was dehydrated and malnourished. The paramedics told her she needed to go to the hospital. "I can't afford the hospital," Diane said. They took her anyway. At the emergency room, a doctor who looked too young to have finished medical school examined her and delivered the verdict. Severe exhaustion, malnutrition, and the beginning stages of anemia. "When's the last time you had a full meal?" he asked. Diane couldn't remember. She ate when she had time, which wasn't often. And when she did eat, it was usually whatever was cheapest: ramen, bread, peanut butter. She was saving every possible penny. "You need rest," the doctor said. "Your body is shutting down." "I don't have time to rest." "You don't have a choice. If you keep going like this, you're going to end up back here. Or worse." They kept her overnight for observation and fluids. The bill would be astronomical, but Diane was too tired to care. She lay in the hospital bed, an 4 in her arm, and stared at the ceiling. She'd hit a new low, working herself to death, literally, for a future that seemed more impossible every day. The next morning, they discharged her with instructions to rest, eat properly, and reduce her stress levels. Diane almost laughed. Reduce her stress levels. Sure. Right after she got her children back, paid off her debt, and found stable housing. She went back to Grace's apartment and slept for 16 hours straight. When she woke up, there was a message on her phone. From Victoria. "The children's first monthly visit is scheduled for this Saturday at 10 a.m. Please be on time." 2 days away. Diane had been so focused on surviving that she'd lost track of the date. Saturday. She'd see her babies in 2 days. It was the only thing that kept her going. Saturday morning, Diane arrived at the supervised visitation facility 15 minutes early. She'd used some of her scarce money to buy small gifts for the kids. A coloring book for Maya, a toy car for Caleb. Nothing expensive, but something to show them she'd been thinking about them. The supervisor, a woman named Linda, greeted her at the door. "Ms. Campbell, the children will be here shortly." Diane sat in the sterile room and waited. 10 o'clock came and went. 10:15. 10:30. At 10:40, Linda came back in. "I just received a call. The children are sick. Mrs. Harrington sends her apologies, but they won't be able to make it today." Diane felt like she'd been punched. "Sick? What's wrong with them?" "I don't have details. Just that they're not well enough for a visit." "Can I call them? Can I talk to them on the phone?" Linda looked sympathetic. "That's not part of the court order." "I'm sorry." Diane sat there for a long moment, holding the coloring book and toy car. She'd waited 30 days. 30 days of marking off calendar squares and surviving on the thought of seeing her children's faces. And now nothing. She left the facility and called the Harrington estate from the parking lot. The housekeeper answered. "I'd like to speak with my children," Diane said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm sorry, but Mrs. Harrington has instructed us not to put any calls through to the children without her approval. I'm their mother. I understand, but I have my instructions. Would you like to leave a message for Mrs. Harrington?" "Tell her to go to hell," Diane said and hung up. She sat in her car. Grace had lent her an old sedan that barely ran, and cried. Again. She was so tired of crying, so tired of feeling powerless. The rescheduled visit was set for 2 weeks later. Another 2 weeks of waiting. During those 2 weeks, everything fell apart. First, Diane lost her waitressing job. The manager said it was because of her collapse, because she'd become unreliable. But Diane knew the truth. She'd seen the way customers looked at her lately. The exhaustion on her face, the tremor in her hands. She wasn't good for business. Then the grocery store cut her hours. Economic reasons, they said. But that didn't make it hurt any less. She was down to just the hotel housekeeping job. 25 hours a week at $13 an hour. $325 a week before taxes. About $1,000 a month. Grace's couch cost her nothing, but she gave Grace money when she could for food and utilities. That left maybe $700 a month for everything else. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. The debt collectors started calling. The credit card companies. The hospital billing department. The apartment complex where she'd been evicted. They wanted their money. They didn't care that she didn't have it. Diane stopped answering her phone. The rescheduled visit finally happened. Caleb and Maya seemed fine, not sick at all. When Diane asked them what had been wrong, they looked confused. "We weren't sick, Mommy," Caleb said. Diane's jaw tightened. They'd lied. The Harringtons had kept the children from her and lied about it. But what could she do? Call Naomi Fletcher? Complain to the court? She had no proof, just the word of a 5-year-old. During that 2-hour visit, Diane noticed changes in her children. Caleb's accent had shifted slightly, his words more formal. Maya had started calling Constance grandmother instead of grandma. They were polite, well-behaved, almost restrained. "Are you happy?" Diane asked Caleb when they were coloring together. He nodded. "Grandmother says we're very lucky. We have a nice house and good schools. But are you happy?" Caleb looked at her with eyes too old for a 5-year-old. "I miss you, Mommy. But grandmother says you're very busy." "I'm never too busy for you." "Then why can't we come home?" Diane didn't have an answer that wouldn't break his heart. Or hers. 2 months passed. Then 3. The monthly visits became a routine of brief joy, followed by devastating separation. Each time, the children seemed a little more distant. A little more Harrington and a little less hers. Diane's savings account, which had once held $800, dwindled to $300. Then $100. Then $42.16. She started skipping meals to save money. She developed a cough that wouldn't go away. Grace begged her to see a doctor, but Diane couldn't afford it. "You already collapsed once," Grace said. "What happens if you collapse again and there's no one around?" "Then I collapse," Diane said flatly. She'd lost the ability to care about her own well-being. All she cared about was surviving long enough to get her children back. But get them back how? She was further from stability now than she'd been 6 months ago. The appeals process had gone nowhere. Naomi had filed motions that were denied. The court saw no reason to modify the custody arrangement. The Harringtons, meanwhile, were thriving. Diane saw them sometimes in the news or on social media. Gerald had been featured in a business magazine as one of the city's rising entrepreneurs. Victoria's Charity Foundation had won an award. Constance had been photographed at some gala, draped in diamonds. And there were photos of Caleb and Maya. At a country club. At a horse riding lesson. At a beach vacation in some tropical paradise. Her children were living a life she could never give them. And maybe, Diane thought in her darkest moments, maybe that was okay. Maybe they were better off. But then she'd remember Maya's screams when they'd first been separated. Caleb's face when he said, "I miss you, Mommy." And she knew that money and country clubs and beach vacations weren't what children needed most. They needed their mother. For months after the devastating custody hearing, Diane hit a new low. She was cleaning a hotel room when she found a wallet someone had left behind. She opened it to check for ID, so she could turn it in to the front desk. Inside was $800 in cash. Diane stared at that money for a long time. $800. Enough to cover her storage unit fee. Enough to buy groceries for a month. Enough to start rebuilding her savings. All she had to do was pocket it, turn in the wallet, and say there was no cash. Who would know? She stood there in that hotel room, holding $800 that wasn't hers, and realized how far she'd fallen. She was actually considering theft. She turned in the wallet with all the cash inside. The guest was grateful, tipped her $20, and Diane went back to work. But she felt hollow inside. She'd done the right thing, and she still had nothing. That night, Diane sat on Grace's couch and looked at the unsigned custody papers that were still in her bag. Victoria's attorneys had sent them 3 more times, each time with a slightly increased offer of financial compensation if she'd just sign over her rights. The latest offer was $50,000. $50,000 to give up her children permanently. It was more money than she'd seen in 2 years. It could change her life, get her out of debt, get her a fresh start. All she had to do was admit defeat. Diane picked up her phone and called her mother in Jamaica. It was late, but her mother answered immediately. "Diane, what's wrong?" "Mama, I can't do this anymore." Diane's voice broke. "I'm so tired. I have nothing. I can't even afford to eat. And they're giving the kids everything. Everything I can't give them. Maybe I should just..." "Stop." Her mother's voice was sharp. "Don't you even think about giving up those children." "But Mama, what if they're better off? Better off without their mother? Better off with people who stole them?" "No, baby. No." Her mother's voice softened. "I know you tired. I know it's hard. But Campbell women don't quit. We bend, but we don't break. You hear me? I feel broken. You not broken. You hurting. There's a difference." Her mother paused. "Something's going to change, Diane. I can feel it. You just have to hold on a little longer." "How much longer? How much more can they take from me?" "I don't know, baby. But I know you strong enough to survive it." After they hung up, Diane sat in the darkness of Grace's apartment. She was 30 years old and had nothing to show for her life except 2 children she barely got to see and enough pain to drown in. But her mother was right about one thing. She wasn't going to quit. She didn't know how she was going to win. She didn't know where the strength would come from. But she knew she'd keep fighting until there was absolutely nothing left of her. What Diane didn't know was that her mother was right about something else too. Something was about to change. Because in an office 300 miles away, a lawyer named Trevor Hughes had finally decided that enough was enough. He'd watched Diane's suffering play out in court documents and news articles. He'd watched the Harringtons systematically destroy her. And he'd kept his silence because Jonathan's instructions had been clear. Wait until they show their true nature. Wait until there's no doubt about who they are. There was no doubt anymore. Trevor Hughes picked up his phone and made a call to a colleague in Diane's city. Then he pulled out a file from his locked cabinet. A file he'd been safeguarding for almost 3 years. Inside was a will. Jonathan Harrington's real will. The one that mattered. And it was about to change everything. But Diane, sitting in the dark with tears on her face and an empty future ahead of her, had no idea that salvation was coming. She only knew that tomorrow she'd wake up and survive another day. And another. And another. Until something changed or she broke completely. She just hoped something changed first. 6 months after losing custody of her children, Diane received a phone call that made no sense. She was at work, on her hands and knees scrubbing a bathtub, when her phone rang. Unknown number. She usually didn't answer those anymore. They were always debt collectors. But something made her pick up. "Is this Diane Campbell?" A man's voice, professional, unfamiliar. "Who's asking?" "My name is Trevor Hughes. I'm an attorney. I have information regarding your late husband, Jonathan Harrington." Diane sat back on her heels. "I don't have money for a lawyer. I'm not asking for money. I need to meet with you. It's about Jonathan's estate." Diane almost hung up. She'd heard enough about Jonathan's estate to last a lifetime. His family already took everything. There's nothing left to talk about. "Ms. Campbell, please. I have information that could significantly impact your situation. Can you meet with me? Today, if possible." Something in his voice made her hesitate. Urgency. But also something else. Hope, maybe. "Where?" she asked. They met at a coffee shop 2 hours later. Trevor Hughes was in his late 40s, with graying hair and kind eyes. He ordered coffee for both of them before Diane could protest that she couldn't afford it. "I've been following your case," he said once they sat down. "The custody battle. I know what the Harrington family has done to you. Diane's defenses went up. If you're a reporter, I'm not. I told you I'm an attorney. And I knew your husband. Diane stared at him. Jonathan never mentioned you. He wouldn't have. I only met with him a few times, and he was very private about what we discussed. Trevor pulled a folder from his briefcase. 3 weeks before he died, Jonathan came to my office. He wanted to create a new will. Diane's heart stuttered. What? He told me he didn't trust his family attorney, Philip Strand. Said Strand had been in Constance's pocket for decades. He wanted someone independent. Someone who couldn't be influenced by his family. So you wrote him a new will? I did. Trevor opened the folder. And in that will, Jonathan left everything to you and your children. The estate, his shares in Harrington Industries, all of it. Diane couldn't breathe. She stared at the document Trevor slid across the table. It looked official, legal, real. But it couldn't be. If that's true, why didn't you come forward before? I lost my home. My children. Everything. Trevor's expression was pained. Jonathan gave me very specific instructions. He said if anything happened to him before he could tell you about this will, I was to wait. He wanted his family to show who they really were. He said, let them take everything. Let them think they've won. Then, when they've shown their true colors, make sure Diane gets what's rightfully hers. He wanted me to suffer? Diane's voice cracked. No. He wanted to protect you from them contesting the will. If we'd presented this immediately after his death, they would have fought it. They would have claimed he wasn't in his right mind, that you'd influenced him, that it wasn't legitimate. They would have tied it up in court for years. Trevor leaned forward. But now, after everything they've done, after they've publicly taken your children, humiliated you, destroyed you, there's a record. Court documents. Testimony. Evidence of exactly who they are. Diane shook her head. This didn't make sense. Things like this didn't happen in real life. Why now? She asked. Why come forward today? Because I've watched you fight for 6 months. I've watched you lose everything and keep going. I've watched them take your children, and I couldn't stay silent anymore. Jonathan's instructions were to wait, but he didn't specify how long. And I think we've waited long enough. Diane looked at the will. Her name was there, in black and white. Diane Marie Campbell Harrington. And below it, provisions for Caleb and Maya. Trusts. College funds. Shares in the company. This can't be real, she whispered. It's real. And it's legally binding. Jonathan had it notarized, witnessed, filed properly. Everything by the book. The Harringtons will fight it. Let them. We have the original document. We have Jonathan's signature. We have witnesses. And most importantly, we have the last 2 years of their behavior on record. Trevor's voice was firm. They can't claim you're a gold digger when you've been living on a couch and working 3 jobs. They can't claim Jonathan was manipulated when he created this document before he even got sick. And they can't claim they're acting in the children's best interests when they've systematically destroyed those children's mother. Diane wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe him. But she'd been disappointed too many times. What do you want from me? She asked. I want you to let me file this will with the probate court. I want you to let me fight for what Jonathan wanted you to have. I can't pay you. Jonathan already paid me. He set up a retainer specifically for this. Everything is covered. Diane looked at this stranger who was offering her everything she'd lost. It felt too good to be true. It felt like another trap, another way for the universe to crush her. I need to think about it, she said. Trevor looked surprised. Ms. Campbell, this is everything. This is your children, your home, your future. I know what it is. But I've learned not to trust things that seem too good to be true. Diane stood up. Give me a few days. She left the coffee shop with Trevor's business card in her pocket and her mind racing. That night, she told Grace everything. Grace's eyes got wider and wider as Diane spoke. Are you serious? This lawyer has a will that gives you everything. That's what he says. So what's the problem? Why didn't you tell him yes right there? Because what if it's a trick? What if the Harringtons sent him? What if this is some kind of setup? Grace grabbed her shoulders. Diane, listen to yourself. You're so beaten down that you can't even accept help when it comes. This could change everything. Or it could be another way for them to destroy me. How? How could this possibly make things worse than they already are? Diane didn't have an answer for that. She spent 2 days researching Trevor Hughes. He was a real attorney, had a small practice specializing in estate law, had been practicing for 20 years. Nothing shady. Nothing connected to the Harringtons. She called Naomi Fletcher and told her about the meeting. "I need you to look at this will," Diane said. "Tell me if it's real." Naomi reviewed the document and called her back within hours. "Diane, this is legitimate. This is a properly executed will. If this is real, if Jonathan really created this, it supersedes the old will completely. Can they fight it? They can try. But this is airtight." Trevor Hughes knew what he was doing. "So what do I do?" "You file it. You fight. You get back everything they took from you." Diane sat with the decision for another day. Part of her was terrified. Terrified of hope. Terrified of believing things could change. Terrified that she'd fight this battle and somehow lose again. But the bigger part of her thought about Caleb and Maya. About the monthly visits that were killing her slowly. About watching her children forget her piece by piece. If there was even a chance, even the smallest possibility, that she could get them back, didn't she have to try? She called Trevor Hughes. "File it," she said. "File the will and let's fight." "You're making the right choice," Trevor said. "I hope so. Because if this doesn't work, I have nothing left. It's going to work. Trust me." Diane wanted to. But trust was something the Harringtons had beaten out of her. Still, 3 days later, Trevor Hughes filed Jonathan's second will with the probate court. He also filed a motion to overturn the current custody arrangement based on new evidence regarding Diane's financial situation. Specifically, that she was the rightful heir to the Harrington fortune and had been fraudulently denied her inheritance. The news hit like a bomb. Diane was at work when her phone started blowing up. Calls from numbers she didn't recognize. Text messages. Emails. She ignored them all until Grace called. "Turn on the news," Grace said. "Channel 7. Diane found a television in the hotel break room. The local news was running a story. Harrington family estate in dispute. Widow claims second will exists. Her photo was on the screen. An old one from happier times with Jonathan. The news anchor was explaining the situation. A hidden will, a bitter family dispute, millions of dollars at stake. Then they cut to footage of Constance Harrington leaving her estate, surrounded by reporters. "This alleged will is fraudulent," Constance said, her face composed but her eyes furious. "My son would never have left his family's legacy to someone he barely knew. This is a desperate attempt by a woman who has already proven herself unfit to raise my grandchildren." The reporter asked about the custody case. "My priority is protecting Caleb and Maya from their mother's increasingly erratic behavior," Constance said. "First she loses her home, then her jobs, and now she's making outlandish claims about inheritance. It's clear she's unstable." Diane watched herself being destroyed on television. But for the first time in 2 years, she didn't feel powerless. Because Constance was scared. Diane could see it underneath the composed exterior. Constance was scared, and scared people made mistakes. Within 24 hours, the Harringtons filed a motion to have the will declared invalid. They claimed Jonathan had been under duress when he created it, that he hadn't been of sound mind, that Diane had manipulated him. They also filed an emergency motion to limit Diane's contact with the children even further, citing the stress and instability of the legal proceedings. They were coming at her with everything they had. The court scheduled a hearing for 2 weeks out. In the meantime, Diane's monthly visit with her children was suspended pending the outcome of the litigation. They'd taken even that from her now. But Diane didn't break. Not this time. Instead, she did something she hadn't done in months. She went shopping. Not at a thrift store or discount outlet, but at a real clothing store. She bought a proper suit. Navy blue, professional, expensive. She used the last of her credit card limit to pay for it. Then she went to a salon and got her hair done properly for the first time in over a year. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she saw someone she barely recognized. Not the broken woman who'd been sleeping on her cousin's couch. Someone harder, stronger. Someone who was done being a victim. Grace saw her when she came home and actually gasped. "Diane, you look like myself again," Diane finished. The 2 weeks before the hearing passed in a blur. Trevor Hughes prepared their case meticulously. He had the original will. He had witness testimony from the people who'd been present when Jonathan signed it. He had bank records showing Jonathan had paid Trevor's retainer from a personal account, not a business one, proving he'd wanted to keep it secret from his family. But most importantly, he had 2 years of documentation showing exactly what the Harringtons had done to Diane. Every court filing, every custody hearing, Every piece of evidence they'd used to paint her as unfit. "We're going to use their own cruelty against them," Trevor said. "We're going to show that the only reason you've struggled is because they stole your inheritance. The inheritance Jonathan wanted you to have specifically, so you'd never be in this position." The Harringtons, meanwhile, brought their army. 4 attorneys now instead of 3. They filed motion after motion, trying to delay the hearing, trying to get the will thrown out before it even went to court. But Judge Thornton, the same judge who'd ruled against Diane in the custody hearing, denied their motions. The hearing would proceed as scheduled. The night before the hearing, Diane couldn't sleep. She lay on Grace's couch, staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. Jonathan dying in his office. The first will reading. Being forced out of her home. Losing her children. All of it because the Harringtons had hidden this second will. Or maybe they hadn't even known about it. Maybe they'd just assumed the old will was all there was, and had moved quickly to take everything before anyone could question it. Either way, they'd destroyed her life. And now, finally, she had a chance to fight back. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Drop this. You can't win. We will bury you." Diane stared at the message. A threat, probably from Gerald or Victoria, using a burner phone. A year ago, that message would have terrified her. 6 months ago, it would have made her consider giving up. Now, it just made her angry. She deleted the message and went to sleep. Tomorrow, the real fight began. And this time, Diane wasn't going into it with nothing. She had the truth. She had Jonathan's love, documented in legal language. And she had something else, something the Harringtons had spent 2 years trying to destroy. She had herself. Beaten, scarred, exhausted, but still standing. And she was done being afraid. The courtroom was packed. Diane arrived with Trevor Hughes at 8:30 in the morning. The hearing wasn't scheduled until 9, but reporters were already camped outside. The story had caught fire over the past 2 weeks. Wealthy family accused of hiding inheritance from widow, custody battle intertwined with estate dispute. It had everything the media loved. Diane walked through the crowd of cameras and microphones with her head high. She wore her new suit, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. She looked nothing like the broken woman who'd represented herself at the custody hearing 6 months ago. Judge Thornton entered at 9 sharp. The bailiff called the court to order, and the battle began. Trevor stood first. "Your Honor, we're here today to validate Jonathan Harrington's last will and testament, created 3 weeks before his untimely death. This will supersedes the previous will dated 4 years earlier. It clearly states Jonathan's wishes for his estate, his company shares, and the guardianship of his children." He presented the document to the judge. The original, with Jonathan's signature, the notary seal, the witnesses' signatures. Everything legal and binding. Richard Ashford, the Harringtons' lead attorney, stood up immediately. "Your Honor, we contest the validity of this alleged will on multiple grounds. First, we question whether Jonathan Harrington was of sound mind when this document was supposedly created. Second, we believe my client's son was under undue influence from Ms. Campbell. Third, the circumstances surrounding this will's creation and the timing of its revelation are highly suspicious." Judge Thornton looked at both attorneys. "I'll hear your arguments. Mr. Hughes, present your case." Trevor called his first witness, the notary who'd witnessed Jonathan's signature. Martha Vance was a woman in her 60s who'd been a notary public for 30 years. She took the stand and confirmed that she'd notarized Jonathan's will. "Did Mr. Harrington seem coherent when he signed this document?" Trevor asked. "Absolutely. He was clear, focused, very specific about what he wanted." "Did he seem pressured or influenced by anyone?" "No. He came alone. He reviewed the document carefully before signing. He seemed determined." "Did he say anything about why he was creating a new will?" Martha nodded. "He said he wanted to protect his family, his wife and children. He said his other family, I assume he meant his mother and siblings, wouldn't approve, but he needed to do what was right." Ashford cross-examined, trying to poke holes in her testimony, but Martha was solid. She had records, dates, her notary log. Everything documented. Trevor's second witness was Jonathan's personal assistant, a woman named Rachel Chun who'd worked for him for 5 years. "Did Mr. Harrington seem different in the weeks before his death?" Trevor asked. "He seemed lighter," Rachel said. "Happier. He talked about his kids constantly. He was making plans for their future." "Did he mention anything about his estate or his will?" He told me he was making changes. He said he wanted to make sure Diane and the children would be taken care of if anything happened to him. He said his family would try to shut her out, but he wasn't going to let that happen. Did he seem mentally unstable or confused when he said this? No. He was the clearest I'd ever seen him. Ashford tried to discredit Rachel, suggested she'd been too close to Jonathan, implied there might have been an inappropriate relationship. Rachel shut that down immediately. "I'm married," she said coldly, "and Jonathan loved his wife. Everyone who knew him could see that." Then Trevor called his key witness, Dr. Patricia Moreno, the same child psychologist who'd testified at the custody hearing that the children were better off with Constance. Ashford looked confused. Constance leaned over to whisper to him. This was their witness. Why was Trevor calling her? Dr. Moreno took the stand, looking nervous. "Dr. Moreno, you testified at the custody hearing 6 months ago that Caleb and Maya Harrington were thriving in their grandmother's care. Do you stand by that testimony?" "Aye." Dr. Moreno hesitated. "I testified to what I observed at that time. But something's changed, hasn't it?" "Yes. Tell the court what you told me last week." Dr. Moreno took a breath. "I've continued seeing the children as part of their court-ordered therapy. Over the past few months, I've noticed concerning patterns. Both children exhibit signs of emotional suppression. They're extremely well-behaved, but it's not natural. It's compliant. They're afraid to express negative emotions." Diane's heart was pounding. "They talk about their mother constantly," Dr. Moreno continued. "Caleb has nightmares about her. Maya has begun hoarding small items. Pictures, a hair tie, a button, things that belong to Diane. Classic signs of attachment anxiety. Why didn't you report this to the court?" "Because I was being paid by Constance Harrington. She made it clear that my reports should emphasize the children's adjustment and stability. I was pressured to present a particular narrative." The courtroom erupted. Judge Thornton banged her gavel. Constance's face had gone white. Ashford was on his feet, objecting, claiming this was hearsay and professional misconduct. But the damage was done. "Your Honor," Trevor said, "Dr. Moreno has provided written documentation of her interactions with Mrs. Constance Harrington, including emails where Mrs. Harrington explicitly instructed her on what to include in her reports. We have evidence that the Harringtons have been manipulating not just the estate proceedings, but the custody case as well." Judge Thornton looked furious. "I want to see that documentation. Now." Trevor handed over a folder. Emails between Constance and Dr. Moreno. Texts. Even a recorded phone call where Constance told Dr. Moreno to emphasize the instability angle regarding Diane. The judge read through the documents, her expression growing darker by the moment. "Mrs. Harrington," Judge Thornton said, "did you or did you not attempt to influence Dr. Moreno's professional testimony in the custody proceedings?" Constance stood, her composure cracking. "I was simply ensuring my grandchildren's well-being was properly represented." "You tampered with a witness." "In my courtroom." The judge's voice was ice. "Sit down." Constance sat. Then it was the Harringtons' turn to present their case. Ashford called Gerald to the stand. "Mr. Harrington, what was your relationship with your brother like before his death?" "We were close. Jonathan and I ran the company together. We were partners." "Did Jonathan ever mention wanting to leave the company to his wife?" "Never. Jonathan understood that Harrington Industries was a family legacy. He would never have given control to an outsider." Trevor stood for cross-examination. "Mr. Harrington, you said you and Jonathan ran the company together. Is that accurate?" "Yes. But Jonathan was the CEO, correct? You were the CFO. Titles don't matter. We were equals." Trevor pulled out financial documents. "According to these corporate records, Jonathan owned 60% of the company's shares. You owned 15%. Your mother owned 20%, and your sister owned 5%. Is that correct?" Gerald shifted. "Yes. So Jonathan had controlling interest. On paper. On paper and in reality. And after his death, those shares went to your mother according to the old will. Your mother then transferred 30% to you, making you the majority shareholder. Correct? Mother wanted someone to run the company effectively. Or she wanted to consolidate power. Mr. Harrington, how much is Harrington Industries worth today?" "Approximately $500 million. "And how much was it worth when Jonathan died?" Gerald hesitated. "About $350 million. So under your leadership, The company has grown by $150 million. Impressive. And you've profited substantially from that growth, haven't you? I've worked hard. Answer the question. How much have you personally made from the company since your brother's death? I don't have exact figures. I do. Trevor presented more documents. $23 million in salary, bonuses, and stock dividends over the past 2 years. While your brother's widow was working 3 jobs for minimum wage and lost custody of her children due to financial instability. The courtroom was silent. You stole his company, Trevor said quietly. You stole his children's inheritance. And you justified it by convincing yourself that Diane didn't deserve it because she wasn't really family. Isn't that right? That's not, I never. You're dismissed. Victoria was called next. Her testimony followed the same pattern. She claimed Jonathan would never have wanted Diane to raise the children alone. She insisted the monthly visits were for the children's benefit, that Diane was too unstable for more contact. Trevor destroyed her too. Ms. Harrington, you filed for grandparents' rights 6 months after your brother's death. Why? To maintain a relationship with my niece and nephew. But you didn't visit them once in those first 6 months. Not once. Why the sudden interest? Victoria's jaw tightened. I was grieving. Or you were waiting for Diane to fail. You wanted her to struggle so you could sweep in and take the children. Isn't that true? No. You told Dr. Moreno to emphasize Diane's instability in her reports. We have the emails. I was concerned. You manufactured a custody case to take your brother's children from their mother. And you did it because you couldn't stand that Jonathan had married a black woman and given her access to your family's wealth and legacy. That's not true. Then why, in your text messages to your mother, which we've also obtained, did you refer to Diane as that Jamaican woman who trapped Jonathan? Victoria went pale. In the gallery, people gasped. Why did you tell your mother that the children needed to be raised properly and not turn out like her? What did you mean by that, Ms. Harrington? I was upset. I didn't mean. You meant every word. You and your family couldn't accept that Jonathan loved Diane, that he chose her, that he wanted her and their children to have everything. So you took it from them. You used your money and your lawyers and your connections to systematically destroy a grieving widow and steal her children. Victoria was crying now. We were trying to help. You were trying to erase her. And you almost succeeded. Finally, Trevor called Diane to the stand. Diane walked up, her legs steady, her hands calm. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. Trevor asked her to tell her story. From the beginning, Diane did. She talked about meeting Jonathan, about their love, about their marriage despite his family's disapproval. She talked about their children, about Jonathan's dreams for their future, about his promise to protect them. She talked about his death and the will reading that left her with almost nothing, about being forced out of her home, about working herself to exhaustion while watching her children's inheritance stolen. She talked about losing custody and the monthly visits that were killing her slowly. And she talked about why she was fighting now. Because Jonathan loved me, Diane said, her voice clear. And he loved our children. And he knew his family would try to erase us. That's why he made a second will. Not because I manipulated him. Not because he wasn't thinking clearly. But because he knew exactly who his family was and what they would do. Do you believe this will reflect Jonathan's true wishes? Trevor asked. I know it does. Because this is exactly what he promised me. That no matter what happened, he'd make sure we were protected. He kept his promise. It just took longer than either of us expected. Ashford cross-examined, trying to paint her as a gold digger, as someone who'd married Jonathan for money. But every question fell flat because Diane's financial history was clear. She'd never asked Jonathan for anything. She'd signed a prenup without complaint. She'd worked after they were married, contributed to their household. She'd lived modestly even when she had access to wealth. The only thing I ever wanted from Jonathan was him, Diane said. Everything else is just what he wanted his children to have. I'm fighting for them, not for me. When Diane stepped down, Judge Thornton called for a recess. 2 hours. Diane sat with Trevor in a conference room and waited. Grace had come to the courthouse and sat with her, holding her hand. You did good, Grace said. Diane couldn't respond. She was too nervous. Everything hinged on what the judge decided. 2 hours later, they were called back into the courtroom. Judge Thornton looked at both sides. Then she spoke. I've reviewed all the evidence presented today. I've examined the will in question, the witness testimony, and the documentation of the Harrington family's conduct over the past 2 years. Diane held her breath. First, regarding the will. I find that Jonathan Harrington's second will, dated 3 weeks before his death, is valid and legally binding. The document was properly executed, witnessed, and notarized. There is no evidence of undue influence or diminished mental capacity. This will supersedes the previous will and is Jonathan Harrington's true last testament. Diane felt Grace grab her arm. Second, regarding the custody matter. I am deeply disturbed by the evidence of witness tampering and manipulation in the original custody proceedings. Mrs. Constance Harrington's conduct in pressuring Dr. Moreno to alter her professional opinions is unacceptable and may constitute criminal interference with a judicial proceeding. Constance looked like she might faint. Furthermore, the evidence presented today makes it clear that Diane Campbell's financial instability, which was the primary basis for removing custody, was directly caused by the Harrington family's wrongful withholding of her inheritance. Ms. Campbell was denied the resources her late husband intended her to have, then punished for not having those resources. The judge looked directly at Constance. The cruelty displayed by this family toward a grieving widow is unconscionable. You systematically destroyed this woman, took her children, and justified it with racism thinly veiled as concern for family legacy. Victoria was crying. Gerald stared at the table. Constance sat frozen. Therefore, I am ordering the following. 1. All assets specified in Jonathan Harrington's second will are to be transferred to Diane Campbell immediately. This includes the estate property, all company shares, and all financial holdings. 2. Custody of Caleb and Maya Harrington is returned to their mother, Diane Campbell, effective immediately. 3. I am referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for investigation into possible criminal charges related to witness tampering and fraud. The gavel came down. Diane couldn't breathe. Grace was hugging her, crying. Trevor was shaking her hand, saying something about execution of the judgment. But Diane was looking at the Harringtons. Constance stood, her face a mask of rage and disbelief. Victoria was sobbing. Gerald looked like he'd been punched. They'd lost. Everything. And Diane had won. Outside the courtroom, the media swarmed. Diane stood at the microphone with Trevor beside her. I want to say something, Diane began, her voice steady. For 2 years, the Harrington family tried to erase me and my children from Jonathan's life and legacy. They used their money, their power, and their prejudice to take everything from us. They counted on me being too broken to fight back. She looked directly at the camera. But I'm still here. My children are still here. And Jonathan's love for us is still here, written in his own hand. Today, justice was served. Not just for me, but for every person who's been told they don't belong. For every person who's been underestimated. For every person who's been broken but refused to stay down. The questions came fast. How did she feel? What would she do now? Would she press charges? Right now, I'm going to get my children, Diane said. Everything else can wait. And that's exactly what she did. The court order required the Harringtons to return Caleb and Maya immediately. Within hours, Diane was driving to the estate, her estate now, to bring her babies home. Constance met her at the door, her face cold. This isn't over. Yes, it is, Diane said. Where are my children? Caleb and Maya appeared in the hallway, looking confused. When they saw Diane, their faces lit up. Mommy! They ran to her, and Diane dropped to her knees and wrapped them in her arms. She held them and cried and didn't let go. We're going home, she whispered. We're going home and we're never being separated again. But we live here, Caleb said, confused. Diane looked up at the estate, at the mansion Jonathan had bought for them, that had been stolen from them. That was theirs again now. I know, baby, she said. We do live here. This is our home. Constance's face twisted. You can't just. I can. Diane stood, holding both children's hands. This house, this property, everything in it, it's mine. According to Jonathan's will and the court's order. You have 72 hours to remove your personal belongings. After that, anything left behind becomes my property. You're throwing us out. Diane looked at this woman who'd made her life hell, who'd stolen her children and mocked her suffering, who'd called her an outsider and tried to erase her. Yes, Diane said simply. I'm throwing you out, just like you threw me out 2 years ago. The difference is, I'm giving you 3 days. You gave me 30. I'm being generous. She walked into her home with her children and didn't look back. Behind her, she heard Constance's voice, shrill and desperate. This isn't over. We'll appeal. We'll fight this. But Diane kept walking. Because it was over. She'd won. The first night back in the estate, Diane couldn't sleep. She lay in the master bedroom, the same room she'd shared with Jonathan years ago, and listened to the silence. Caleb and Maya were asleep down the hall in their old nursery. She'd checked on them 4 times already, still half convinced someone would take them away again. But no one was coming. The house was hers. The children were hers. Everything was hers. It didn't feel real yet. Grace had helped her move out of the apartment that same night. It took 20 minutes to pack everything Diane owned. 2 suitcases of clothes, a box of documents, the kids' toys from storage. That was it. 2 years of her life fit in the back of Grace's car. You going to be okay here by yourself? Grace asked as they stood in the massive foyer. Diane looked around at the marble floors, the crystal chandelier, the sweeping staircase. I don't know. This place has a lot of bad memories. Then make new ones. Better ones. Grace hugged her. You did it, Diane. You actually did it. After Grace left, Diane walked through the empty house. Most of the furniture was still there. The Harringtons hadn't had time to take much. But it felt hollow, like a museum of her old life. She found herself in Jonathan's study. His desk was still there, though his papers were gone. She sat in his chair and put her head in her hands. I wish you were here, she whispered to the empty room. The kids need you. I need you. But Jonathan was gone, and Diane was alone with a house full of ghosts and a future she had no idea how to navigate. The next morning, Trevor Hughes called. We need to discuss the company shares. You now own 60% of Harrington Industries. That makes you the majority shareholder and effectively the owner of the company. Diane stood in the kitchen, watching Caleb and Maya eat breakfast. They seemed okay. Quiet, but okay. What does that mean practically? It means you have decisions to make. Gerald has been running the company as CEO. Do you want to keep him in that position? Diane thought about Gerald's testimony in court, about how he'd profited millions while she'd been homeless, about how he'd never once acknowledged his brother's children. No, she said. I want him out. You have the authority to remove him, but you'll need someone to run the company. Do you want to hire a new CEO or... Can I do it myself? Trevor paused. You could, but running a $500 million manufacturing company is complicated. You'd need to learn the business, understand the operations. Jonathan taught me a lot before he died. He used to talk about the company all the time, and I was 2 semesters away from a master's degree before I had to drop out. I'm not stupid. I never said you were. But this would be a significant undertaking. Everything about the last 2 years has been a significant undertaking. At least this time I'll be fighting for something I actually own. 3 days later, Diane walked into Harrington Industries headquarters for the first time in over 2 years. She wore a new suit, properly tailored, expensive. Her hair was styled. She looked like she belonged there. The receptionist did a double take when she saw her. Mrs. Harrington? I'm here for the board meeting, Diane said. I'm not sure you're on the list. I'm the majority shareholder. I don't need to be on a list. The emergency board meeting had been called by Gerald in a desperate attempt to block Diane's takeover. All 7 board members were present when Diane walked in. So was Gerald, sitting at the head of the table like he still owned the place. He stood when he saw her. You can't be here. I own 60% of this company. I can be wherever I want. Diane took the seat at the opposite end of the table. Please continue your meeting. Gerald's face was red. This is a closed session. Not anymore. Diane looked at the board members. Some of them she recognized from company events years ago. Others were new. Gentlemen, I'll keep this simple. As majority shareholder, I'm exercising my right to restructure company leadership. Effective immediately, Gerald Harrington is removed as CEO. The room erupted. Gerald was shouting. 2 board members were trying to talk at once. The company attorney was frantically looking through bylaws. Diane waited for the noise to die down. Then she continued. I'm appointing myself as interim CEO while we search for permanent leadership. I'm also dissolving the current board structure and appointing new members who weren't complicit in stealing my children's inheritance. You can't do this, Gerald said. Actually, I can. Check the corporate bylaws. Majority shareholder has the authority to make executive decisions. Trevor Hughes, who'd been standing quietly by the door, stepped forward and handed out packets to each board member. These are the legal documents supporting Mrs. Harrington's authority. You'll also find termination agreements for those of you who've served on this board for more than 2 years. Generous severance packages are included. This is insane, one of the older board members said. You don't know anything about running a company. I know that under Gerald's leadership, the company grew by $150 million, growth that was built on my husband's foundation. I know that Gerald paid himself $23 million over 2 years while claiming poverty prevented him from helping his brother's widow. I know that every person in this room stood by and watched my children's inheritance stolen. Diane's voice was calm but hard. So no, I don't have decades of experience. But I have something none of you have. I actually care about what this company was supposed to mean. She stood up. You have until end of business today to accept the severance packages. Anyone who refuses will be terminated without compensation. Your choice. She walked out, leaving chaos behind her. Trevor caught up with her in the hallway. That was risky. Maybe. But I'm done playing nice with people who tried to destroy me. By the end of the day, 6 of the 7 board members had accepted the severance. The 7th, an older man named Harrison who'd actually worked with Jonathan, asked to meet with Diane privately. Your husband was a good man, Harrison said when they sat down in what was now Diane's office. I should have stood up for you when he died. I didn't. I'm not asking for my job back. But I want you to know I'm sorry. It was the first time anyone connected to the Harrington family had apologized to her. Why didn't you say something? Diane asked. Because I was a coward. Constance Harrington is a powerful woman. I convinced myself it wasn't my business. Harrison looked old and tired. I was wrong. Diane studied him. Then made a decision. I need people I can trust. People who knew Jonathan and understood his vision for this company. If you're willing to help me learn how to run this place properly, I'll keep you on the board. Harrison looked surprised. After what I just told you, you're the only one who had the guts to admit what you did wrong. That counts for something. Over the next few weeks, Diane learned the business inside and out. She met with department heads, reviewed financial reports, sat in on production meetings. It was overwhelming and exhausting, but she pushed through. Harrison was true to his word, guiding her through the complex world of manufacturing, supply chains, and corporate politics. Slowly, Diane began to understand not just how the company worked, but how Jonathan had built it. She found notes he'd left in old files. Ideas for expansion, for improving worker conditions, for making the company more sustainable. Dreams he'd never gotten to implement because he'd died too soon. Diane started implementing them now. She raised the minimum wage for factory workers by 20%. She instituted paid family leave. She invested in equipment upgrades that made the work safer and more efficient. The changes cost money short-term, but employee satisfaction went up, turnover went down, and productivity increased. The industry publications started noticing. New leadership at Harrington Industries shakes up company culture, one headline read. Another, from widow to CEO, Diane Campbell's unlikely rise. But while Diane was rebuilding the company, the Harringtons were falling apart. The district attorney had indeed opened an investigation into witness tampering. Dr. Moreno had provided testimony and evidence. Within a month, Constance was indicted on 2 counts of obstruction of justice. She hired the best lawyers money could buy, but the evidence was overwhelming. The trial was scheduled for 6 months out, and legal experts were already saying she'd likely face jail time. Victoria's Charity Foundation collapsed after major donors pulled their support. The board members resigned. The organization filed for bankruptcy within weeks. Victoria herself became a social pariah. The same society pages that had once celebrated her now ran stories about her role in stealing her brother's children. Gerald lost everything when Diane removed him from the company. His salary disappeared. His stock dividends dried up. He'd been living beyond his means, counting on his CEO income to fund a lifestyle he could no longer afford. Within 2 months, he was selling off assets. His luxury cars, his vacation home, his designer wardrobe. Diane heard through Trevor that Gerald had taken a job at a competing manufacturing company as a regional manager, making less than $200,000 a year. From CEO of a $500 million company to middle management. The fall was poetic, but Diane didn't celebrate their destruction. She was too busy rebuilding her own life. The children were healing, but it was slow. Caleb had nightmares for the first month. Maya became clingy, afraid to let Diane out of her sight. Diane hired a real therapist, not one paid by the Harringtons, to help them work through the trauma. They're resilient, Dr. James told Diane after a few sessions. Children are remarkably good at healing when they feel safe. Just keep being consistent. Keep showing up. They'll be okay. And gradually they were. Caleb started smiling again. Maya's death grip on Diane's hand loosened. They made friends at their new school, a good school, but not the elite academy Constance had enrolled them in. Diane wanted them to have a normal childhood, not one built on status and appearances. 6 months after the court victory, Diane threw a birthday party for Maya. She turned 5. The party was at the estate, but Diane had transformed the place. She'd redecorated, removing the cold formal furniture and replacing it with things that felt warm and lived in. The house finally felt like a home instead of a mausoleum. Grace was there, of course, and Naomi Fletcher, who'd become a friend beyond just being an attorney, and Rachel Chun, Jonathan's former assistant who'd testified at the trial, and Harrison and his wife, and a dozen kids from Maya's class running through the yard, screaming and laughing. Diane watched from the patio as Caleb and Maya played with their friends. They looked happy. Really, genuinely happy. "You did good," Grace said, coming to stand beside her. "We did good," Diane corrected. "I couldn't have survived without you." "Yes, you could have. But I'm glad you didn't have to." That night, after the guests left and the children were in bed, Diane sat in Jonathan's study. She kept it mostly the same, except for adding photos. Pictures of happier times. Jonathan with the kids. Their wedding day. Family moments frozen in time. "We made it," she said to his photo. "It took longer than it should have. And it hurt more than I thought I could survive. But we made it." She pulled out the letter he'd left with Trevor. The one that had been included with the will. She'd read it 100 times, but she read it again. "My dearest Diane, if you're reading this, then I'm gone and my family has shown you exactly who they are. I'm sorry I can't be there to protect you. I'm sorry you had to fight this battle alone. But I know you, Dee. I know how strong you are, even if you don't see it yourself. You're going to survive this. You're going to fight for our children. And you're going to win. Everything I built for you and Caleb and Maya. Not for my mother's legacy. Not for the Harrington name. For the family we chose. For the life we made together. Don't let them erase you. Don't let them make you believe you don't belong. You belong everywhere I wanted you to be. I love you. Always have, always will. Jonathan." Diane folded the letter carefully and put it back in its envelope. Then she opened her laptop and started working on the presentation she had to give to investors next week. She had a company to run, children to raise, a future to build. The past 2 years had broken her down and rebuilt her into someone she barely recognized. Someone harder. Someone who didn't trust easily. Someone who knew exactly how cruel the world could be. But also someone who knew she could survive anything. A year after the court victory, Diane stood in a different courthouse for a different reason. Constance Harrington's sentencing. The jury had found her guilty on both counts of obstruction of justice. The judge was handing down the sentence. "Mrs. Harrington, you used your wealth and influence to corrupt legal proceedings and deprive a mother of her children. You showed no remorse for your actions and continued to maintain that you were acting in the children's best interests, even when confronted with evidence to the contrary. I'm sentencing you to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 2 years of supervised probation." Constance's face went gray. She was 71 years old. The idea of prison was clearly something she'd never actually believed would happen to her. Diane watched from the gallery as Constance was led away. She felt nothing. Not satisfaction. Not anger. Just a hollow sense of closure. Outside, reporters asked if she was happy with the sentence. "I'm not happy about any of this," Diane said. "I would have been happy if Jonathan was still alive. If his family had welcomed us instead of trying to destroy us. If my children had grown up surrounded by love instead of manipulation." She paused. "But sometimes the only justice you get is knowing the truth came out. That people saw who everyone really was. That's enough." She went home to her children and didn't watch the news coverage. 2 years after the court victory, Harrington Industries was thriving under Diane's leadership. The company had expanded into sustainable manufacturing, won contracts with major retailers, and been recognized as one of the best places to work in the state. Diane had proven everyone wrong. Not just about her ability to run a company, but about who she was. She wasn't the gold digger the Harringtons had painted her as. She wasn't the unstable single mother the courts had initially seen. She was a businesswoman, a CEO, a mother who'd fought through hell and come out stronger. Caleb was 8 now, thriving in school. He'd started talking about maybe running the company one day, just like his dad. Maya was 6, fierce and funny, and completely recovered from the trauma of her early childhood. She didn't remember much about living with Constance. Those memories had faded, replaced by better ones. Diane had started dating again. Nothing serious yet. She wasn't sure she was ready for that. But she'd learned to open herself up to the possibility that maybe, someday, there could be happiness again. Love again. For now, though, she had everything she needed. One evening, she was reading to the children before bed when Maya asked a question. "Mommy, are you glad the bad things happened?" Diane looked at her daughter, surprised. "What do you mean, baby?" "The teacher said that sometimes bad things make us stronger. Are you glad you got stronger?" Diane thought about it. About Jonathan's death. About losing her home. About the custody battle and the years of struggle. About everything the Harringtons had put her through. "I'm not glad the bad things happened," Diane said carefully. "I wish your daddy was still here. I wish we'd never had to fight so hard. But I'm glad I learned how strong I could be. I'm glad I didn't give up. And I'm really, really glad I have you and your brother." Maya snuggled closer. "I'm glad too." After the children were asleep, Diane walked out onto the back terrace. The estate grounds stretched out before her, lit by soft landscape lighting. Her home. Her sanctuary. Everything Jonathan had wanted her to have. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts. Found her mother's number in Jamaica. "Diane, how are you, baby?" "I'm good, Mama. Really good." They talked for an hour. About the kids, about the company, about life. Her mother had been right all those years ago when she'd said Campbell women don't break. They'd bent Diane pretty far, but she'd survived. Before hanging up, her mother said something that stuck with her. "You know what I'm proudest of? Not that you won. Not that you got everything back. I'm proud that you stayed kind. After everything they did to you, you could have become just like them. Mean and bitter and cruel. But you didn't. That's the real victory." After they hung up, Diane thought about that. She'd had opportunities to be cruel. When Gerald lost his job, she could have made it worse. When Victoria's foundation collapsed, she could have pushed harder, made sure she lost everything. When Constance went to prison, she could have gloated. But she hadn't, because becoming like them would have meant they'd truly won. They would have succeeded in changing who she was at her core. And that was the one thing they'd never been able to take from her. 3 years after the court victory, Diane established the Jonathan Harrington Memorial Foundation. It provided support for widows and widowers facing estate battles, funded legal aid for people fighting unjust custody cases, and offered business mentorship for people trying to rebuild their lives after loss. The foundation's first major initiative was a scholarship program for graduate students who'd had to drop out due to family emergencies. Students like Diane had been. At the foundation's launch event, Diane gave a speech. "My husband died believing he'd protected his family. He tried to, but the people who should have honored his wishes tried to steal everything he'd built. For 2 years, I was broken, homeless, separated from my children, working 3 jobs and still drowning." She looked out at the crowd. "But I survived. And now I want to make sure other people in similar situations have the support I didn't have." The foundation became her passion project alongside running the company. Slowly, the Harrington name began to mean something different in the community. Not old money and exclusivity, but second chances and support. Jonathan would have liked that, Diane thought. Now, I want to ask you something before we finish this story. Have you ever watched someone go from rock bottom to complete triumph? Have you ever seen real justice served, not just in movies but in real life? Drop a comment and let me know, because stories like Diane's remind us that sometimes the good guys actually do win. If you've made it this far in this story, thank you for taking this journey with me. Hit that like button if Diane's story moved you. Subscribe to this channel because I have more stories like this one. Stories about people who refused to stay down, who fought against impossible odds, who proved everyone wrong. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to fight back. That justice might take time, but it's worth waiting for. That strength isn't about never breaking. It's about putting yourself back together after you shatter. 5 years after the court victory, Diane Campbell stood on the same courthouse steps where she'd once lost everything. But this time, she was there for a dedication ceremony. The family court building was unveiling new protocols for custody cases. Reforms designed to prevent the kind of abuse Diane had suffered. Reforms she'd helped design and fund. Caleb and Maya stood beside her, now 10 and 8. Old enough to understand what this meant. Your father would be proud, Diane told them. Of you, of what we've built, of how we turned something terrible into something good. Do you still miss him? Caleb asked. Every single day, Diane said honestly. But I'm not sad anymore. I'm grateful. For the time we had. For the love he left us. For everything he did to protect us. Even when he wasn't here to see it through. That night, back at home, Diane sat in Jonathan's study one last time with his letter. She'd read it so many times over the past 5 years that she had it memorized. But this time, instead of feeling sad, she felt at peace. She'd done what he'd asked. She'd survived. She'd fought. She'd won. And more importantly, she'd become someone she was proud to be. Not because of the money or the company or the estate, but because she'd faced the worst the world could throw at her and come out the other side with her humanity intact. She folded the letter and put it in a safety deposit box with Jonathan's wedding ring and the children's baby photos. Things to keep safe. Memories to treasure. But not things to live in anymore. Because Diane Campbell wasn't defined by her past anymore. She was defined by what came next. And what came next was a future she'd built with her own 2 hands. A future Jonathan had made possible. A future the Harringtons had tried to steal but couldn't destroy. A future that belonged entirely to her. She turned off the light in the study and went to check on her children one last time before bed. They were both asleep, safe, happy, loved. Everything else was just details. Diane had won the war. Not by becoming like her enemies. Not by destroying them the way they'd tried to destroy her. But by surviving. By refusing to give up. By proving that love and truth and stubborn determination could beat money and power and cruelty. That was the real story. That was the real victory. And as Diane closed the door to her children's room and walked down the hall of her home, the home Jonathan had wanted her to have, the home she'd fought to reclaim, she finally understood what her mother had meant all those years ago. Campbell women don't break. They bend. They struggle. They fall. But they always get back up. And Diane Campbell was living proof. Thank you for watching this story all the way through. If you enjoyed it, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling me what you thought. Where are you watching from? What part of Diane's story resonated with you the most? I read every comment, and I love hearing from you. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when I post a new story. Because I have more tales of triumph, revenge, justice, and people who refuse to let the world break them. Share this with someone who needs to hear that they're stronger than they know, that their story isn't over, that the darkest night comes right before the dawn. Until next time, remember, your struggles don't define you. How you rise from them does. See you in the next story.